I'll get this up on the screen. First things first. Every semester, state board policy requires that all students are given the opportunity to turn off the YouTube link. Okay, so, as I was saying, state board policy requires that students perform an evaluation of their instructors. Okay, this is, and I'll show you this in just a second. But what I'm going to ask everybody to do is, if you scroll to the end of the class, you are going to see in the finals week a link that says course evaluation. This is the link that I want you to use to access the course evaluation for two reasons. First of all, Moodle tracks what you do on when you log into the site. By clicking on this link here, it tracks that you've completed the course evaluation. I will never have access to that information of who does or doesn't. Okay? However, if I get at least 80% participation up from the class, I can give you guys some extra credit. Okay? In order for me to drive up that participation, I have set it up so that you may not take the final exam without having completed the course evaluation. Okay? Now, I do not see your individual responses. I only get a report from our department secretary that tells me X number of people have taken it. And as soon as that reaches 80% of all the students in the class, everybody gets extra credit. Okay? This only works if you click this link. If you get to the course evaluation any other way, it will not count and therefore will not release the final exam. Yes?
It's not available on the website yet.
What's that?
I said it's not available on Moodle yet.
It is available on Moodle. We opened it.
It's
Okay.
It's still hidden. I see it.
Okay, I need to fix something. Okay, I realized that
Yeah, now it is. I just had to refresh the page.
yeah, you might need to refresh, because I just changed this about, that's what I was furiously typing right before class started. Because I just realized I want to make sure that everybody can have access to that. The earlier we get that done, the earlier I can release those extra credit points so you can have a sense of where we're at. Okay? Does anybody have any questions? Again, I do not see your individual responses. Those are aggregated by the department secretary, and she will strip out any personally identifying comments. So if, and just as a personal request, as you take this exam, it will give you a series of what we call Likert questions on a scale of 1 to 5. How much do you agree or disagree with something? Those are helpful. But at the very end of the assessment, there is a section, these are the things that I like most about the class. These are the things that I like least about the class. Here are other comments. That to me is the most important part of the course, or at least of the course evaluations. When you guys take the time to specifically articulate what worked, what didn't work, that is the most helpful to me as an instructor in terms of figuring out how I can improve the overall quality and operation of the class. Yes?
When you click on the link at the page, it says, cannot find the data in the database. Oh, yeah.
Okay, I think I need to update that. I think that the link is from last semester. I just need to go in and get that fixed. But the reason I wanted to point this out is this link will be, evidently isn't yet, but this link will be live. And I'd like to encourage you, just so that I make sure, I hate waiting until the last minute, we get enough participation. Okay, just to pick on Christy for a second, we've been spending quite a bit of time talking about sample size and research and how important it is that we get as broad a sample as possible. The more I get participation, the more I can put confidence in the comments. If I only have 2 students that comment on the class and they both give me high thumbs up, that kind of strokes my ego, but doesn't give me a good sense about what? How the class actually works. Okay, so the more I get comments, both good and bad, I've been doing this for a while. I am ready to hear negative commentary. I do not hold it against anybody, and I do not get your results until after I have submitted final grade. So there is no possibility of your commentary coming back and saying, oh, well, the heck with everybody gets an F. Which would be highly ironic in a course on ethics, right? Okay. But just making sure everybody's on the same page. Is everyone good with this? Does anybody have any questions? So like I said, clicking on that link for the course evaluation after I get it fixed is the only way that Moodle will let you into the final exam. Now, the final exam will not happen until the week after Thanksgiving, but I want to make sure that everybody has access to it ahead of time. Okay. So let's talk about the next thing, which is, and actually let me bring up the class again because I want to make sure that everybody has, we got a couple of things going on this week. Number 1, by the end of the week, we have a quiz on chapter 8, which we finished last week, about organizational structures, right? The rational, what else? The political and the caring. Oh, and I could tell you some stories about my experiences last week that kind of were funny about how rational, political, and caring organizations work inside this own department. But I'm going to forgo that. Anyway, click on the right class. So don't forget that chapter 8 quiz is due by Sunday. Okay? That is an open book exam, by the way, as all the others, and everyone goes, good, because that's how I've been taking them. All right, there we go. The next thing I want to spend some time talking about is your next assignment. Okay, it is the case study. This is the last big assignment before our final exam. Okay, this assignment is not due until November 8th. But I want to spend some time talking you through it so that you can get started on it today. Even though I know probably very few of you are actually going to hop on that. Okay, so let's begin. So this case study, how long is it going to be? Settle in, it's up on the board. 1,000 to 1,200, or to 1,200 words. So it is double what our assignments up to this point have been. So this is the big paper. And even when I say big paper, 1,000 to 1,200 words, is this big compared to some of your other classes? No. Okay.
Dr. Lambert, I can't see your screen.
I forgot to say, thank you. Appreciate it. Is it up now?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're writing a case study, 1,000 to 1,200 words, that outlines a real or constructed scenario that presents an ethical challenge in a workplace. What's the difference with constructed? You have the option. At least not everybody wants.
A real is something that you've experienced or seen it happen, and then constructed is something that you imagine.
Okay, so the idea is either a real experience or a hypothetical one. Your call. Real doesn't necessarily have to happen to you, but it is based on real events. It could be something somebody else has shared with you. Okay? Now, this scenario presents an ethical challenge where? This is important because of the name of the class. In the workplace. This is not a personal ethic. It is not a legal challenge. It is a workplace-based ethical dilemma. Okay? Similar to the examples posted in the textbook, and there are several, they're all clearly identified, so you can go in and look at them. Do not copy them. What I really want you to encourage you is to look for and investigate and find a case study relevant to your chosen career field. So I don't want this to be just a general workplace ethical quandary. I want you to find something that is relevant to your field, something you either have experienced or that you would be likely to experience in your field. Okay? If you want, and if it's not in your field, I would expect you to what? What's the statement? Or one sufficiently similar and defended as such. What does that mean? Justin.
Maybe a scenario that may not include your field, but could be applied to your field with just different variables.
Exactly. So it doesn't have to happen, I'm going into robotics, and it has to be a robotics case. It could be instrumentation. It could be applied energy systems. But I would need you to defend how is the aspects of this case relevant to the field I'm going into. Okay? And identifying the example in which a decision would be made that requires the application of an ethical standard. So here's what you are going to have to include in that 1,000 to 1,200 words. Number one, general introduction to the case with enough information about what's going on that people can understand the ethical aspects of it. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Number two, clarification of the individuals involved and their perspectives. How does their perspective influence our understanding of the ethical challenge? So for example, we're about to look at the Massey case on Thursday, right? They included several pages of perspectives from different individuals. Why? And it wasn't just because, hey, let's fill up the book. What do you think?
Not everybody sees things the same.
Exactly. And because, for example, if we think back on the midterm, the question about Sylvia, we needed to understand Sylvia's perspective about wanting her money back from the gym. We need to understand the assistant manager who says, yeah, I can understand this, but I'm not going to get money out to pay her back. I need to understand my perspective as a newly hired person who has the job of selling these memberships. I need to understand everybody involved and what they're bringing or what their claim is to what the final decision should be. Okay? Number three, an articulation of the actions or choices that you think need to be made and the ethical background or foundation upon which they're based. What would you do and why? And how do you justify that? What ethical standard or what ethical model are you using to provide the warrant or the justification for those actions? Last, the inclusion of at least 3 outside sources using what style of citation? APA. That means both APA in text and bibliographical or the references page. Now, if you go back to our case study, that booklet that I created for the case study, or not for the case studies, but for theory paper 1, those APA guides that I included, they have one about citation that I expect you guys to reference. Is everyone cool with this? Any questions? So these are the 7 things that you're going, or the 5 things, sorry. There are 7 things you're going to be graded on. Clarity of thought and support, the quality of support and evidence, the inclusion of multiple perspectives, the inclusion of at least how many ethical standards? 2. Why am I going to include at least 2?
So we have 2 perspectives on it?
Well, we have to have 2 perspectives because if we say this is the only way to do something, does that align with what we've studied this far in our semester? No, any given situation can be viewed through multiple ethical perspectives. right? So, yes.
So in this paper, we're kind of basically presenting ourselves with a moral dilemma or ethical dilemma, either real or fake. And we're kind of just talking our way through how we would handle the situation.
Well, you're not answering, you're not saying, here's what would be done, here's what I would do. But if I was to, so if you remember the examples from the case, from the midterm, there were questions that said, how would I do, if I was to answer this from the ethic of justice, here are the things I would need to figure out. If I was to do this from the perspective of Kant's empirical or categorical imperative, here are the things I would need to do. It might be helpful to, okay, I'm trying to subtly hint, red light should be flashing, go back to the midterm and look at the essay prompt. Okay, it is not plagiarism if you acknowledge where the information comes from. Am I being subtle enough? Okay, you need to tell me what questions you would need to ask in order to answer this perspective. Does this make sense? Okay, the reason I bring that up, you're going to turn your case study in and it's going to be graded on its own merits. That's the first part of this assignment. The second is you're going to paste that very same case study into a class forum or discussion board. You are then going to be expected to go and answer the questions of 3 of your different classmates. So you're basically going to give your own case study, and then you're going to be asked to go and respond to the case study of 3 other people in the class. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? The case studies have to be posted by Sunday, November 8th. Your responses have to be posted by Wednesday, November 11th. That makes sense to everybody? And so that's why I want to give you some heads up that this assignment is coming so that you can work ahead and make sure that you're ready for November 8th. Why is that a big deal? What is likely going to be happening between now and November 8th? What's that? I'm sorry.
The code orange are gonna go.
Well, the code orange might happen and we might be going fully online. I doubt it because I don't think Little's going to want to get involved with higher education unless the state board chooses to do so. Much more realistically, the likelihood is a crap ton of homework, and I don't know exactly how you measure that. Not sure what unit of measurement a crap ton of homework is, but it can't be good. It's probably going to be coming from all of your other classes. So I want you to be able to make sure that you ride the wave and get this done ahead of having all of that other stuff dumped on you. Is everyone cool with that? Anybody online have questions about this? Okay. So now let's talk about our class. I'm sorry, we're already half an hour into class and we're just finally getting to the lecture. Like I said, we have a lot to cover today. All right, so we're talking today about what? Discrimination where? Discrimination in the workplace. Okay? So our goal for today is to talk about the aspects of the first 2 elements of the chapter. Number 1, what are we supposed to be looking at? Where does this kind of chapter start?
Affirmative action.
Affirmative action. So we're going to be looking at the legal implication, the legal climate and implications of discrimination in organizations. The first 4 or 5 pages of the chapter focuses on what? Discrimination where? At a university. Why there?
Because it was a criteria for acceptance, not a criteria
Yeah.
for fall.
No, it was a criteria for acceptance. It's this entire concept of, what was the term? Affirmative action. Why does that matter to us in this class?
It also applies to workplaces and how you get hired at workplaces.
Exactly. So the reason why we're talking about this is because this is a major topic of conversation about business practice. And since this course is focused on ethics where? Ethics in business, it's relevant to talk about how do we negotiate or interpret something like discrimination, both positive and negative. Okay? So, what did we find in, what was it, Grutter versus Bollinger? What did we discover here? What was one of the findings that the Supreme Court, now bear in mind, this went to a judge who voted one way, then went to an appeals court who voted the exact opposite, and then Grutter took it to the Supreme Court. Okay, what did the Supreme Court find?
That it's fair and constitutional for the university to show preference to minority admissions if its goal is to achieve diversity.
Okay. So let me ask you this question. This is not a law class. So why are we talking about legal findings that are incredibly dense and thick and hard to understand? Why are we talking about that in this course? Please, not everybody at once. Justin.
Well, because even though it's a very legal thing, it's also heavily involved in ethics. And it defines the ethics that happen in schools and in business.
Okay, if we remember what when we talked about rights, we said there are 3 types of rights, correct? What are they?
Contractual.
Contractual?
Positive.
What's that?
Was it positive?
Those are types, or that's what rights defend, positive and negative rights. Okay, but we have contractual, which are specific rights that exist within a legal document. Okay, contractual rights, unfortunately I can't draw this in a way that everybody else online can see, but if we think of it like a Venn diagram, we start with a small circle, and that's contractual rights. That belongs inside a larger scope, which is legal rights, which are, these are things that law allow for everybody who belongs to that system. But that falls within an even larger circle of what?
Natural or individual rights.
Natural or moral rights. Okay? So when we talk about legal findings, what type of those 3 rights are we talking about? The legal rights, the one in the middle. These are things that laws allow us to do or not do. So what does that have to do with the focus of this class? Are we talking about personal or moral rights, class? Well, we've introduced it because we need to understand it, right? But we're not talking about the rights given to all people. We're talking about the rights that exist within what context? Business. What does that then suggest to us? We are talking about this idea of legal rights establish business ethics. What is it correct for an organization to do? Organizations only really exist in legal terms. Therefore, we have to understand the law in order to understand what is ethically acceptable. Okay? Okay, so if we continue on, are there specific terms? It is fair and constitutional for a university to show preference to minorities in admissions if its goal is to achieve diversity in a way that is narrowly tailored to achieve the goal. Of all of the ethical models that we have talked about, which one do you think is does the language of this kind of evoke? Its goal is achieve diversity in a way that is narrowly tailored to achieve the goal. Is it utilitarianism? Is it rights or Kant's categorical imperative? What about justice? What about caring? What about virtue? What do you think? Sierra, what do you think?
I'm sorry, I zoned out for a second. What was the question?
The question is, the language of 7.1.1, right at the top of the screen, sounds like which of the 5 ethical models that we have really examined closely this semester? The idea that something has to be narrowly tailored to achieve a goal.
It sounds utilitarian.
Okay. Well, but if we look at utilitarianism, utilitarianism's goal is what? To maximize utility at the smallest amount of cost for as many people as possible. Does that sound narrowly tailored?
Well, I mean, they later talk about how having a diversity in education makes much better employees and associates and things like that. So it could be argued that they're trying to make the best situation for everyone out of minorities and of majorities, and for those that are going to be involved in learning with them in the rest of their careers.
Okay, so the idea that diversity is a utilitarian goal totally makes sense. Okay, however, diversity by itself, if the goal is to just include diversity, the problem is it's such a broad thing that it is difficult to apply because it does not recognize what? Individual rights or behaviors, right? If my sole goal or my goal is diversity, that's so broad that it can be applied to everybody. And if it's applied to everybody, it's impossible to enforce because diversity for one is automatically going to exclude somebody else. Unless it is, what's the term they used? Narrowly. We have to limit and specifically put bounds on what diversity is and isn't so that it becomes operable. Which of the models does that seem to recognize? Limiting the individual impact.
Is it justice?
It's not just, it's looking at benefit versus, but it's looking at their entitlements. That's rights, right? The idea of rights says this is what I can or I should be encouraged to do, which is what? What type of right is that? If it's something that has to be done to allow me to do things. Positive right. What would negative rights then be? I have to be protected from something. So diversity, in order for it to be a right that means something, it has to be narrowly tailored or narrowly defined in order for it to be something we can do. We have to have specific elements that define what diversity is, because then we're encouraging people to follow it. If it's something they can apply to everybody, then it becomes impossible to enforce. Okay? Now, what is the specific right in this case that Bollinger argues is the operative concept at the University of Michigan. Access to universities and access to law schools does what? What is it? Is this a negative or positive rights statement? The one that's highlighted on the screen.
That's positive.
It's positive, right? What is it saying?
It basically opened up access to every race to be able to be a leader or a talented and qualified individual.
Okay, so if I fit into that category of talented and qualified individuals, I have a positive right, which means the university has an obligation to do what? If I have a positive right as a qualified individual, I have a positive right. The university should do everything it can to help me gain access both to the university and specifically to the universities, in particular law schools. You have to do what you can to get me in there, because what does it do? What does going to law school, according to this argument, provide the individual?
Training to become a national leader.
The training to become a national leader. Okay? So from a rights perspective, the argument is I have to encourage people from any race or ethnicity to be able to gain access to universities and specific law schools, because historically we have seen individuals who go to these types of places do what? They become national leaders. That's the argument that the Supreme Court agreed with and said, yes, because of this, we have to implement policies known as affirmative action that do what? What is the purpose or function of an affirmative action system? The end.
To give, basically it was to give rights to, for equality for all, so that everybody had an equal chance to do things. It wasn't meant to put others above others, I guess. It was supposed to level the playing field.
It isn't to create a level playing field. I'm going to disagree with that. Affirmative action, as described in these policies, and when we look at, and we're going to go into this in the history, it is not to say that everybody has a level playing field. Basically, the idea of affirmative action is that these groups have been so harmed by lack of access in the past that we are going to promote their application, that if every other thing is equal, individuals from certain minorities are going to have an extra chance to get into law school. That's the entire premise of the entire lawsuit, is that Grutter, who was a white woman, said that her application, even though she was equal to other individuals who applied, her right was denied because somebody else got extra rights. That's the entire argument here. Should groups that have been historically discriminated against receive additional bonuses or additional assistance to gain access to the same rights as everybody else? That's the entire debate here. Supreme Court said as long as, and this gets back to why we were talking about this, So let's go back to that concept. What did they say was the requirement that has to be in place for us to use discriminatory practices like affirmative action? Because it is discriminatory. What was their argument?
That it has to narrowly tailor to promote diversity.
If we are going to discriminate in favor of certain groups or individuals in order to promote positive rights, I can't just do that across the board. It has to be very narrowly tailored or limited. Here is exactly how it's going to be done to increase representation from one group against others, so as, even though I'm violating their right, Grutter's argument is you violated my right to be able to get access to an education. Is it fair or legal to violate an individual's right? Yes, it is. It is legal to violate somebody's right as long as what? When would it be okay to violate somebody's right?
If they condone to the violation of it.
Okay, go for it one more time, Joseph.
If they condone to the violation of it, so basically, like, I have the right to privacy unless I'm trying to get a job with an employer, then I'm like voiding my rights, so he can violate those, I guess, my privacy rights.
Okay.
I'd argue with this, I mean, with the Supreme Court ruled that it's no longer a right. You're not getting your rights violated because it's not a right guaranteed by the legal system anymore, therefore it's not a right.
No, not necessarily. It is acknowledging that Gruner's right to free access to a public institution is being violated. However, it's being violated because the society has determined that diversity is a greater interest to the overall population than the idea that everybody gets equal access to things. The idea that equal access and diversity are not necessarily equal. And so the states or the Supreme Court decided in this particular case, we can violate the rights of individuals in order to achieve greater society rights. As long as the manner in which those violations occur are narrowly tailored. Here is how, when, and why we can violate rights. And the idea of just everybody having equal access, the problem is that's not narrowly tailored or limited. That was the problem that and that's something that we continually see coming from the United States Supreme Court, is that most of the time arguments that are made are sent back or denied because they are too broad in their scope. We want to violate, okay, so for example, the state or the district attorney of Southern New York wanted access to Donald Trump's financial records. They applied. That one got approved. The United States House of Representatives then applied for the same thing. We want access to Donald Trump's financial records. That one got denied and returned back to Congress. Does anybody know why? Any guesses based on what we've just been talking about?
We're not specific enough as to what they want.
They weren't specific enough about what they want or when and how and why they got it. They just simply said, we want access to the president's financial records. And the Supreme Court says his right to privacy, even though he is probably one of the most public individuals that there can be, cannot be denied, cannot be violated unless you give us narrowly tailored reasons how and why you want them. You don't get to just have a fishing expedition where you get to go and look for things that he did wrong. You have to know and specifically say, this is why we get to violate his privacy. Okay? The Supreme Court is very big into narrow limitations to what can or cannot be done, especially when it gets into violating individual rights. As a way to, those rights only have value when they protect or deny people who want to violate. Therefore, if I'm giving you a reason to violate, it has to be specific. Okay? Now, not everybody in the Supreme Court agreed with that decision. Now, bear in mind, this decision took place when? Does anybody remember? 2006. So relatively speaking, this is a relatively new policy. Not everybody agreed. Clarence Thomas penned this statement about that finding. I believe that what lies beneath the court's decision today are the benighted notions that one should tell when racial discrimination benefits rather than hurts minority groups, and that racial discrimination is necessary to remedy general societal ills. What in the heck does benighted mean? Anybody want to take a guess?
In the state of pity.
What's that?
In the state of pity.
Okay, it is talking about pity, but that's not what benighted means.
Is it like feeling sorry for someone?
Okay, okay. The idea here, benighted means, okay, if I say something is, sorry, benighted means like night, or what's another term for night? Or a concept. What happens when it's nighttime outside? It's dark. Darkened or misguided is another concept for benighted. So what is Clarence Thomas saying about the idea that, number one, somebody can tell when racial discrimination benefits a minority group, and that racial discrimination is necessary? What does he feel about those two propositions? Does he like them?
No, I think he's trying to say that they're like based on a false precedent.
Yes, they are based on false or incorrect beliefs. He believes that racial discrimination benefiting a minority is an incorrect or outdated idea. He also believes that using racial discrimination to remedy general societal ills, racial discrimination in and of itself is the societal. You cannot use a wrong to make something right. That's Clarence Thomas's argument. He then continues to come to this comment. These programs stamp minorities with a badge of inferiority and may cause them to develop dependencies or to adopt an attitude that they are entitled to preferences. How could that be problematic from an ethical perspective?
I think it makes the burdens and benefits not equal.
Okay, which violates which ethical perspective?
Justice.
Yes, he says that we can never have justice if our practice of reverse discrimination creates a situation where the very minorities continue to be treated like minorities, and in which they develop attitudes that make them believe that they are entitled to specific benefits that others are not. The goal, as much as possible, is to create what Deanne called what? Equality, or an equal playing field, where everybody's access to benefits and burdens is equal. Which type of justice does that describe? Egalitarian. Our goal is to arrive at an egalitarian justice. Everybody is treated the exact same, where nobody receives benefit. And what is Thomas arguing in this statement that's still highlighted? The idea of affirmative action does what?
Provides like an extra benefit for minorities at the same time giving them a burden.
Okay? Therefore, the idea of affirmative action is antithetical or an enemy or opposite to the idea of egalitarian justice, which is the stated goal of the legal system in the United States. All right. This gets us to the idea of attempts to achieve diversity through affirmative action are themselves forms of unjust reverse discrimination. What is that idea? What is reverse discrimination?
Discriminating against the non-minority groups?
It is creating the same type of illicit or inappropriate discrimination, this time turning that very discrimination back upon the people that had benefited or implemented it in the past. We do not solve a wrong, or we do not solve a wrong by using another wrong. Okay. So if we go back to the idea of discrimination, we identify it as, in this case, it is not simply separating or categorizing. In this case, when we talk about the concept of discrimination, what are we talking about, according to the textbook?
Distinguishing one object from another?
Okay? Let's look at this definition. Let's unpack it a little bit. The idea of discrimination from a legal perspective or an ethical perspective, I'm going to leave out the concept of wrongful, but it is the act of distinguishing illicitly. Now, what does the word illicit mean?
Inappropriate, right?
Yes, it's inappropriate, or here's the reason why I left out the wrongful act of distinguishing wrongfully among people. Seems like it's a little bit repetitive. I just used a different word to try to avoid the repetition. It's the same thing. So the act of distinguishing wrongfully among people not on the basis of individual merit, but on the basis of prejudice or some other invidious or morally reprehensible attitude. Say, huh? What does that mean? So discrimination is when I choose among people, not because of their individual merit, but on what? What's the first concept?
Prejudice.
Prejudice. Okay. Or what else? Joseph.
They're kind of saying like we don't base or distinguish on the other person on their individual merit, but on our own attitude and like our own in this. If I don't know, on our own
You're right on.
attitude and personality.
Any kind of attitude where we're making our decision not based on the quality of the person, but on our own belief or attitude that has nothing to do with the selection at hand. So any type of judgment that I make that separates my decision from individual merit and bases it on anything other than the quality, character, and preparation of the individual in question is inappropriate. It's wrong from an ethical standard, because how does that violate an ethical standard? How does this statement violate ethics? Think of Kant. What does Kant argue?
Everyone knows you want to be treated.
I should only accept as law that action which, if it was given to me, should it be applied to every other person. So if I want to be judged based on my own qualifications, my own merit, anything else introduced into a decision that does not base it on individual merit is ethically inappropriate. That's where discrimination violates the concept of ethics. So to put this into the context of what we're focused on in talking about ethics, to discriminate in employment is to make an adverse decision or set of decisions against employees or prospective employees who belong to a certain class because of morally unjustified prejudice towards members of that class, whether or not that prejudice is consciously held. What does that mean? Connor, what do you think? What does this statement right here, highlighted on the screen, what does that mean?
Like to me, what does it mean to me?
Yeah.
So pretty much just if you're discriminating against people, it's just a bad decision to make against your employees. It sets bad examples.
Okay. It basically says anytime I make a decision that has a negative impact on an individual that I employ or am likely to employ, that occurs when that decision is based on reasoning or rationale that has nothing to do with the task at hand, but against my feelings of the individual. Is it okay to fire somebody? Yes. Is it okay to fire somebody if they belong to a protected class? Yeah, it is. If I can clearly state that my reasons for firing that person have to do with what? Individual merit, rather than their status in a protected class. If I'm hiring somebody because of their skill, is that appropriate? If I have an individual from a protected class and somebody that's not from that protected class, is it okay to hire the person from the unprotected class? As long as I can clearly state how my decision relates to individual merit and not to prejudice or other morally reprehensible attitudes. Okay, it does not mean, yes.
What do you have any examples where discrimination would be ethically appropriate?
Based on the definition that we just described, no. Because remember, discrimination is not just when I make a decision for or against somebody from a protected class or not protected class. Discrimination occurs when I make an act of distinguishing somebody not based on their individual merit, but on prejudice or another morally reprehensible attitude. If I can show exactly for cause, this is the reason I'm hiring somebody or firing somebody, is that discrimination? It doesn't matter which group they belong to, as long as the reason I'm doing it is for cause, not for the prejudice or some other invidious reason.
So this is a little bit off topic question a bit, but the gutter versus boiling case, would that have affected like the Native Americans reimbursement they're getting?
Native Americans would probably be considered a protected class.
Yeah, well, and how they receive money every month due to reimbursement, was that part of that case?
No.
It wasn't
No.
talking about that?
It has nothing to do with whether or not, because that's based on treaty law. The reason that Native Americans might be receiving reparations from the state or the federal government is due to either treaty law or violations of treaty law that have existed. What we're talking about here is if two people that have exactly the same transcript, they've taken the exact same classes, they've received the exact same grades, they have the exact same scores, all of their admittance application materials are exactly the same, and the only difference is race. Should race be considered in the decision factor if all other things are equal? That's the fundamental question. Grutter versus Bollinger said the answer is yes, in very specific circumstances. Okay? Thomas argues, if you agree with that, you're creating a situation where that is going to continue to be the case and it will never end, that we will never eliminate the imbalance because you are inherently creating systemic programs that do this. And that's what we're about to get into. And this is another hot button topic that has come up specifically in this time frame that we find ourselves. How many of you have heard of the concept of systemic racism? I think if you have made the mistake of turning on any kind of news channel, regardless of your political ideology, you will have heard this term at least once or twice. Okay? This gets into a very interesting argument. Most kinds of discrimination, and so this is why this all matters, folks. We talk about the idea of discrimination, and it begs the question. There's 4 different types of discrimination, right? We have 2 factors. One is the intent, and the other is scale. So let's talk about intent first. What are the 2 factors in terms of intent? Conscious or unconscious? What would conscious intent entail?
You recognize what you're doing and you continue to do it.
I am aware of my feelings and I act on it of being fully aware. Okay, what about unconscious? What would unconscious intent be? Anybody?
It's based on your pre-existing prejudices that you have unconsciously that you don't recognize that you have.
So it's any kind of influence or attitude that directs or influences my choice, but that I am not consciously aware of. I'm not doing it because I know that I'm doing it. It's happening, but I didn't realize it. I don't have agency. or awareness. I am not fully informed of my decision. So the first question about discrimination is, do I discriminate consciously or unconsciously? Okay, that's the first factor. The second is scope. What are the two scopes or factors involved in scope? Whether the discrimination occurs on the individual level or on what? It's either the individual or the system. So what does that mean? Jesus, what do you think? What is the difference between individual versus systemic?
To be honest, I really don't know.
Okay? I just highlighted it. Does that happen? Does that help? What would individual discrimination be or look like? How many people are involved?
One.
One. Either one person is the one who's doing the discrimination, or one person is receiving the discrimination. What about systemic? What do you think that suggests?
Is that like the example with the university?
Which would be multiple people are involved. Either multiple people are receiving the discrimination, or multiple people are participating in it. And so that's the big question. And the debate was, can discrimination occur at the institutional or systemic level? That was the debate. In the 1960s and 70s, the attitude was, where did discrimination occur?
That's like the attitude, like there's just a couple bad apples.
That all discrimination occurred at the individual level. There was no way for systems to be discriminatory because systems do not act. Every action has to eventually boil down to what? The individual that does it. The system cannot be guilty, only. However, in the 1980s, we see a significant switch. Well, actually, in the 70s and 80s, we see a significant switch. And the realization that policies and procedures at the institutional or business level can be inherently discriminatory, regardless of individual practice. So this gets at the University of Michigan. If every time somebody applies, we automatically consider race as a part of their application process, that automatically affects who? If every time somebody applies, their race is considered as a part of the application, how many people does that apply to?
A lot of people.
It affects every single one. That's systemic. If every guidance counselor that makes the admissions decision about whether we accept person A, B, or C, if every single one of them is told that they have to weight race in the application, how many people does that involve? Every single applications or admissions officer. Both of those suggest that discrimination does not just exist on the individual level, it can exist on the systemic level. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about, so when we talk about systemic racism in these days, what we're talking about is not whether or not there is a good or bad apple in an individual police force. We're asking, are there policies or practices that by their nature already affect a large number of individuals, or do they affect every individual that has to make that decision? If the answer is yes, it would indicate that we do not have individual, but we have institutional discrimination. Now, so when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about a specific type of what?
Discrimination.
Based on systemic racism. What? What's that?
Based on the laws that are set in place, that are set in
The
the
laws
system.
are set in place in direct individual, or sorry. If we accept the argument of systemic racism, it would argue that there are policies within law enforcement systems that inherently direct officers to act or make decisions based on race as opposed to other equally balanced types of individual merit. I know it's kind of weird to make the law decisions based on merit, but that's what we're saying. Does somebody merit or earn the right to have to be pulled over? Okay. What might be some reasons that would merit pulling somebody over? Reckless driving. Okay. What's the word? Operating a vehicle in a compromised condition. Speeding. Okay. Those would merit it, and we would say that if that individual is doing that, they deserve to be pulled over. Okay. However, if I'm driving along and the person who is driving the car influences whether I do or do not pull them over, okay, unless there is additional, and the way the law says, the purpose for pulling somebody over has to be the behavior, not the appearance of the individual. To base my judgment on their appearance is inherently discriminatory because they have not broken a law other than to have an appearance, which is incredibly problematic from an ethical perspective, right? The argument that the law should be that whatever I want done to, that which I would feel should be done to me should be done to all. Nobody wants to be pulled over by a police officer for any reason, especially if I'm complying with traffic law. Now, if I was to add to that, I'm going to get pulled over not because I'm violating traffic law, but because of my very appearance, that becomes incredibly problematic. Especially when I feel that based on behaviors and interactions, that the possible consequences can escalate, right? We should not enter even into that interaction unless there is clearly warranted individual merit for the interaction. Okay. Now, I recognize, and I know time's almost up, but I want to really address this. This is another type of situation, just like when we talked about the incest argument a couple of weeks ago. This is a very hot button topic. And people have very strong opinions over questions like Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter. Okay? The purpose of this class is not to pass judgment on your own personal beliefs. However, the purpose of this class is to get you to reflect on your ethical model. How do I make decisions that are in line with my own moral code and which are likely to produce consequences that are in line with my own moral code? Okay? It is okay to ask questions, to reflect and engage in self-reflection and modification of my beliefs if they are not in line with what I truly believe to be true. If that's wrong, folks, then we are totally hosed. If we cannot assess whether or not we're in line with our own ethical models, and if our behavior is in line with our own moral standard, there's no purpose even talking about this. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that you have to change, but I would hope that as a result of this, that you can at least engage in the reflection, the consideration of the possibility that things in my life need to change, that things in my behavior need to change. Whether they do or not, or whether they need to or not, is not the purpose of this class. But to introduce the possibility of how to evaluate. That's at the core, and I hope that that is clear in our conversation here. I say that because I know that we're talking about topics that if I was to go to my in-laws and start talking about this stuff, I get thrown out of Thanksgiving dinner. I'm not supposed to bring up politics or religion at the table. Okay? The problem is, we're not talking about politics here. We're talking about how do we decide what is right and wrong and how to do that. But that's at the core of what politics should be about. Okay? Just to finish up, has anybody, there's a video going around. It's a political ad for the gubernatorial candidates in Utah. Has anyone seen this one? It's got two guys on the screen. I can't remember their names. One guy says, I'm a Republican, and I think you should vote for me for governor. And then the other guy gets up and says, well, I'm a Democrat, and I really think you should vote for me for governor. And then they look at each other and they say, we can disagree, but that doesn't mean we have to hate and attack each other. We both have a deep and abiding love for our country. We have different opinions about what is the right decision, but we can talk about it without becoming enemies. My point is, when we talk about ethics, we aren't talking about individuals anymore. We're talking about our own moral compass and how we adhere to that. And it's valuable to be able to discuss that with other people, especially people with whom we have a great level of admiration. For example, talking to your parents about your moral code makes sense because for a lot of us, our moral code came or was instilled by our parents. And if there are things that we feel like need to be changed, adapted, or added, it makes sense to talk to them. But I want to make it very clear that I do not, or I'm not trying to advocate for any political position. I am not advocating that everyone is supposed to throw away their moral code and rebuild it from scratch. Okay? This is not a class of at least I'm not trying to make it a class of indoctrination. And if you feel that way, I have failed in my job as an instructor to be able to strip it of that concept. That is not my goal to tell you what is right or wrong. It is to introduce questions that you can ask yourself, the answer to which you come up with in your own life. That's my hope. Okay? All right. Let's see. We had 2 more pages of this, but I can't force you guys to say. So anyway, so that's everything we have for today. I appreciate everybody staying. Remember, case study, get started on it. Chapter 8 quiz, don't forget it. That's everything I have, folks. We'll talk to you later.
Professor?
Yes.
Are we still doing the honors session today?
It is on Thursday.
That's right. Thanks.